The rain lashed mercilessly against the towering leaded of the Blackwood estate, an imposing architectural marvel, nestled deep within the wealthy enclaves of Newport, Rhode Island. Among the older locals who had lived in the historic coastal for generations, the property was quietly referred to in hushed, reverent tones as the Palace of Forgotten Memories. Its magnificent vaulted ceilings, shimmering crystal chandeliers, imported from across the ocean, and immaculately manicured gardens spoke volumes of a vast, intimidating wealth that had been carefully accumulated over many long decades. Yet, on this particular stormy evening, amidst all the suffocating opulence and priceless vintage artifacts, within the heavy walls of the grand house felt deeply, inexplicably, and irreparably broken. Sitting silently at the head of a massive mahogany dining table, designed to comfortably accommodate 20 people, Helen occupied barely a tiny fraction of the enormous echoing space. Beauty-plated dinner of exquisite food that remained entirely untouched, while a delicate glass of expensive red wine trembled slightly between her aging, fragile fingers. At the far opposite end of the long table, an empty chair, yen with an intricately carved wooden back, seemed to scream into the heavy silence, standing as a haunting, daily reminder of a profound and devastating loss. The elderly woman stared fixedly at that empty chair, that someone would suddenly step out of the shadows to fill it, as if the relentless years could miraculously rewind and hand back exactly what time had ruthlessly sizzling permission stolen, without asking for permission. It was in that exact, agonizing moment of overwhelming stillness that the first heavy tear quietly fell from her eyes. It was not a dramatic sob, nor was it the kind of loud, performative crying that actively seeks the attention and pity of those walking by. The grand room was the slow, resigned weeping of a weary soul that had forcefully learned to suffer completely alone in the dark for far too many years. A single solitary tear traced a slow path down familiar wrinkles of her distinguished face, navigating the lines of her skin as if it had traveled that exact sorrowful road countless times before. The antique grandfather clocks in the echoing hallways continued away the passing seconds with absolute unfolding in the dining room, crackling without a single ounce of compassion, casting long dancing shadows across the expensive silk wallpaper. Helen remained perfectly still, trapped in her own silent agony, with that empty chair firmly lodged in her vision like a cruel, jagged thorn. Thought possessed the ability to extract no one, that is, except for a quiet young woman named Lucy, who happened to be standing just outside the heavy oak doors. As a professional cleaner at the Blackwood estate for only a few short weeks, taking the demanding job purely out of absolute necessity to support her small family, she was a dedicated single mother to a young girl, arriving at the intimidating mansion every single morning and staying late into the evening because she sensed an unspoken sorrow lingering in the air. From her very first day polishing the silver, and dusting the antique books. She had astutely noticed that, despite the overwhelming abundance of beautiful, expensive items, the enormous house desperately lacked basic human warmth. As she quietly wiped down the hallway mirrors, she caught a sound so incredibly faint that any other passing servant would have easily dismissed it as the wind rattling the old window panes. Because she intimately understood the distinct muffled sound of a desperate soul trying hard to hide its pain, Lucy immediately stopped her work, tightly gripping the soft cleaning cloth in her worn hands. She could have easily kept walking toward the kitchens, pretending she had heard nothing, knowing full well that her strict employment contract contained absolutely no clauses to demanding she privacy. To her wealthy employer, she was hired to clean floors, not to act as a trained nurse or a family therapist. But there are certain fleeting moments in human existence where a compassionate heart completely overrules professional boundaries. Leaving her cleaning carton abandoned in the dimly lit corridor, Lucy slowly pushed the dining room door open and felt her breath hitch at the heartbreaking sight of the supposedly formidable matriarch, looking incredibly small and lost. Taking a deep, steadying breath, the young cleaner stepped fully into the grand room, moving with a gentle grace as she approached the crying woman who had terrified so many other staff members. Helen stiffened slightly, completely unaccustomed to anyone daring to cross the strict, invisible boundaries of class and authority that had defined her isolated life for over a decade. Without calculating the immense risk to her vital employment, Luce reached out, retrieved a pristine linen napkin from the table, and knelt softly beside the grieving widow to gently wipe the dampness from her cheek. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, Lucy leaned in and spoke a few profoundly simple words of comfort, words that instantly made the wealthy widow close her eyes as a completely different kind of tear. One of genuine, unexpected relief spilled over her lashes. Robert Blackwood did not sleep a single wink that long, tempestuous night, unable to shake the image he had witnessed upon his unexpected arrival at the family estate. He remained seated in the heavy leather armchair of his childhood bedroom, a space his mother had preserved perfectly over the years, as though the relentless passage of time held no authority within the mansion walls. The lofty vaulted ceiling, the pristine ivory walls, and the classic literature books lined up on the wooden shelves which remained exactly as he had left them many years ago when he eagerly departed for college. Yet, the brief, whispered words he had quietly overheard, while standings continued to echo violently in his troubled mind. Pulling him back to a time he had desperately tried to forget. When morning finally arrived, bringing a pale, watery sunlight that struck through the thick Rhode Island clouds, the massive estate predictably woke up to its meticulously organized daily routine. Patty, the cheerful veteran cook, began vigorously kneading fresh dough for the morning pastries, filling the sprawling downstairs corridors with the incredibly comforting, buttery scent of baking bread. Ethan, the dedicated headset's gardener, could be seen outside meticulously pruning the wet rose bushes, carefully loading his wheelbarrow with the heavy, rain-soaked branches that had fallen during the intense midnight storm. The PT&D. Lucy arrived flawlessly on time with her organized cleaning cart, projecting that same unwavering, peaceful attitude that the entire household staff had already come to deeply respect and admire. Robert watched the young cleave carefully from the shadowy of the grand central staircase, studying her methodical, unhurried movements as she began polishing the antique brass fixtures in the grand foyer. He observed how she respectfully paused in front of an old family portrait hanging on the wall, a photograph featuring a much younger Helen alongside her late husband Arthur and a teenage Robert. He simply could not decipher. It was not the idle, fleeting curiosity of a newly hired employee exploring a rich house, but rather something far more intense, deeply personal, and entirely unsettling to the wealthy businessman watching from above. Deciding he could no longer endure the suffocating suspense, Robert slowly descended the carpeted stairs, politely greeting her, before abruptly requesting that she follow him into the secluded, wood-paneled library for a private conversation. Once, inside the quiet library that smelled beautifully of aged paper and expensive floor wax, Robert leaned against his late father's enormous mahogany desk and stared intently at the young woman standing before him. He directly questioned her bold actions from the previous night, fully expecting her to offer a series of nervous apologies or defensive explanations regarding her completely inappropriates of professional household protocol. Instead, Lucy looked him dead in the eye with an absolute unnerving calmness, stated plainly that she had simply seen a devastated human being crying alone in the dark and had reacted accordingly. Showing basic human compassion to a suffering woman was somehow considered wildly inappropriate in his world. Then, she was proudly guilty and would absolutely do the exact same thing again, without hesitation. Struck by her profound, unwavering honesty, Robert felt a strange, uncomfortable knot tightening painfully in his chest, realizing he was speaking to someone who simply refused to be intimidated by his vast wealth or status. The secret son des researches, desperate to uncover the source of his intense, nagging familiarity with her voice, he shifted his aggressive interrogation tactics and began politely asking about her personal background and her previous avenues of employment. That she had worked tirelessly various cleaning it where it office tirelessly. Few years. A necessary pivot. After she was abruptly forced to abandon her medical studies, when he gently pressed her about what exactly she had been studying. She paused for a fraction of a second. Quietly, her nursing degree, she had been very close to earning her nursing, intervened. When life dramatically intervened, Robert studied her calm, beautiful face intently, searching desperately for a specific sign or hidden clue that might neatly explain the overwhelming, chaotic emotions violently storming inside his usually disciplined mind. When he softly asked why she had walked away from such a noble and stable career path, Lucy smiled a small, slightly melancholic smile and explained that her young daughter had unexpectedly arrived before graduation. She stated with remarkable dignity that her child immediately became her absolute priority, requiring her to take whatever honest, flexible jobs she could easily find to ensure they both had a warm roof over their heads. Attempting to dig just a bit deeper into her hidden past, Robert asked if she had any extended currently living nearby in the bustling coastal city to help share the heavy burden of motherhood. Neris, looking out the large library window toward the sprawling, perfectly manicured lawns, Lucy softly replied, and her daughter, navigating the massive, complicated world entirely on their own. When Robert finally asked where she was originally from, the distinct pause that followed was entirely unmistakable. Not overly dramatic, but heavy with the undeniable weight of a secret carefully guarded for many long years. She quietly named a tiny, nestled deep in the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts, a remarkably specific location that made Robert's heart completely stop beating in his chest. As she calmly excused herself to return to her pressing cleaning duties, Robert was left standing completely frozen in the quiet library, realizing with mounting terror that the impenetrable walls he had built around his youth were finally crumbling. Later that crisp afternoon, something wonderfully unprecedented occurred that sent quiet ripples of genuine shock through the tight-knit ranks of the Blackwood Estate's dedicated household staff. For the very first time in several desolate months, Helen actively requested her heavy wooden walking cane and slowly made her way outside to enjoy cool, refreshing breeze sweeping through the expansive rear gardens and rearsons. Patty nearly dropped a massive porcelain mixing, walking upright past the large bay windows, while Ethan completely froze in place, his sharp pruning shears suspended mid-air. Lucy, who was diligently wiping down the exterior patio glass, completely ignored the surprising spectacle and simply continued her rhythmic work. Though her observant eyes subtly tracked the older woman's slow, deliberate progress among the vibrant flowers, standing rigidly on the second-floor stone balcony with a forgotten, completely cold cup of dark coffee in his hand, Robert meticulously observed the incredibly brief, silent exchange between his mother and the unassuming cleaning woman. Helen had paused near the patio, looking directly at Lucy, and offered a remarkably subtle, respectful nod of her head, a gesture carrying far more profound emotional weight than a standard, polite greeting between employer and staff. Lucy paused her cleaning, straightened her posture, and gracefully returned the small nod with an equal measure of quiet dignity, an interaction that violently churned the deep, unresolved anxieties pooling in Robert's stomach. That evening, utterly incapable of bearing any longer, Robert retreated into his private study, firmly locked the heavy door, and immediately placed a secure call to his most trusted corporate investigator, Cinda. Mark was a highly efficient, incredibly discreet professional who routinely handled highly sensitive private matters for Robert's massive espionage and not its massive financial empire without ever asking unnecessary or probing questions. Robert ordered him to thoroughly investigate every single detail regarding Lucy's entire existence, what she had been doing, and who she truly was behind her quiet exterior. Knowing Robert's usual strict adherence to pure business matters, Mark cautiously asked if there had dangerous security breach or financial theft at the estate. Clearly surprised by the intensely personal nature of the sudden request, Robert, staring blindly at the dark velvet curtains of his study, simply replied that he did not know yet, firmly instructing Mark prioritize this urgent personal assignment above every other pending corporate contract. The highly detailed, confidential dossier that Mark hand-delivered to the estate. Was anxious. Days later, contained entirely mundane, ordinary information that initially seemed to wildly contradict Robert's overwhelming, paranoid suspicions. On paper, Lucy was exactly who she claimed to be, a remarkably hard-working, honest woman with absolutely no criminal history, maintaining a modest, quiet life while fiercely protecting and providing for her beloved young daughter. She possessed absolutely no massive debts, no hidden legal conflicts, and absolutely nothing that would suggest she harbored any malicious, calculated intent in seeking humble employment within the wealthy walls of the Blackwood estate. However, there was one singular, incredibly glaring detail prominently highlighted on the third page of the thick report, a piece of crucial information that Mark knew better than to ever transmit over any hackable digital channel. The official public records explicitly confirmed that Lucy was indeed originally born and raised in that tiny, secluded town in the Berkshire Mountains, a remarkably quiet place. Robert knew far better than he ever publicly admitted. It was the exact obscure town he had purposefully retreated to many years ago, living a remarkably simple, anonymous life for several months under the strict disapproving radar of his demanding, wealthy family. Reading the familiar name of the small town, printed neatly in stark black ink, Robert felt the surrounding room begin to violently spin, forcing him to grip the edges of his heavy wooden desk just to remain upright. But the absolute most devastating piece of evidence lay entirely in what was completely missing from the comprehensive background report. A massive void that practically screamed the horrifying truth directly into Robert's face. According to the official birth registry, carefully pulled by the investigator, the young daughter's legal surname was solely her mother's, and the specific section designated for the biological father's name had been left completely blank. This glaring omission, often viewed by uninvested bureaucrats as a simple administrative oversight or missing data point, struck Robert with the catastrophic force of a speeding freight train crashing through his meticulously ordered reality. He forcefully pushed himself away from the desk, his expensive leather chair loudly scraping against the polished hardwood floor, and aggressively paced the length of the study as his brilliant analytical mind rapidly connected the remaining pieces. He began frantic. He had subconsciously avoided for days, calculating exact dates, years, and specific timelines. With a cruel, unrelenting precision that allowed absolutely no remaining room for comforting coincidence. When the chronological numbers flawlessly aligned, Robert Biss pressed his burning forehead against the freezing glass of the study window, staring out into the pitch-black garden where his father's prized rose bushes, ashi, swayed softly. If his horrifying realization was indeed the absolute truth, Lucy had not arrived at his family's mansion by sheer accident. And those impossibly gentle words, "Mother," were not spoken by a stranger. The absolute most terrifying aspect of this grand revelation was not the remote possibility of being cleverly manipulated or deceived by an elaborate con artist seeking a massive, unearned financial payout. The true horror that left him completely breathless in the dark was the devastating realization that absolutely no one had tricked him. Everything was real, and he had cowardly allowed this beautiful truth to live in the shadows for years. Later that week, Lucy, from the sprawling estate, her dedicated and deeply perceptive teacher, Miss Clara, had recently pulled Lucy aside to enthusiastically praise the young girl's exceptional artistic focus. Noting that she drew with a profound, serious intensity rarely seen in small children, with the boundless, unburdened energy of youth leaping into her mother's waiting arms with tremendous, heartwarming joy. "Mommy!" burying her face into Lucy's neck, completely oblivious to the massive. Her hard-working mother carried in total silence every single day, just to keep them both safe. Her beautiful name was Victoria, and she possessed a wild mane of dark, wavy hair, enormous, expressive eyes, and an incredibly unique, intense way of constantly observing busy world moving around her. She was remarkably serious for a child of her tender age, yet possessed sudden, brilliant flashes of pure, unadulterated joy that could instantly illuminate the darkest, most depressing room she ever walked into. That evening, while sitting at the tiny, wobbly dining table in their remarkably modest second-floor apartment, was completely absorbed in drawing a complex picture in her favorite sketchbook. Quietly washed the dinner dishes, Lucy watched her precious daughter closely, corner of her eye, constantly searching every small, inherited facial gesture for any hidden sign of the complicated truth she could not yet bring herself to openly discuss, without ever lifting her intense gaze from moving rapidly across the white paper. Victoria suddenly stated in a matter-of-fact tone that the elderly lady residing in the giant house was a very good person. Lucy paused, scrubbing the ceramic plate, her hand submerged in warm, soapy water, and cautiously asked her highly observant daughter exactly what made her say something about a woman she had never formally profound about. Met with the brutal, flawless logic unique to innocent children. From cleaning that specific mansion, she looked terribly different but heavy, like when she read old hidden letters, drying her wet hands. Careful a worn kitchen towel, Lucy slowly approached the small table, pulling up a wooden chair to sit directly across from the little girl who consistently saw far too much. Lucy gently confirmed that the lady in the grand estate was indeed a kind woman who unfortunately carried a tremendous amount of hidden pain safely locked away deep inside. 2. Victoria paused her drawing, looking directly into her mother's eyes with absolute, unwavering sincerity, and innocently asked if the wealthy lady's deep pain was exactly like the secret pain they carried together in their tiny home. Stip Mia, feeling a sharp, painful lump rapidly expanding in her tight throat. Lucy managed to softly whisper a contradiction, forcing a brave, reassuring smile, as Victoria simply nodded her small head and immediately returned to her detailed artwork. Lucy remained seated there for a very long time, agonizingly studying the sharp angle of her daughter's jawline and the intense, focused furrow of her brow, strikingly familiar traits that undoubtedly belonged exclusively to Robert Blackwood. Back at the Blackwood estate, an entirely unprecedented morning event further disrupted the normally rigid, predictable routine that the vast household staff had strictly followed for many consecutive years without variation. Helen suddenly requested that her grand formal breakfast be served outside, on the stone patio, situated right next to the beautiful, sprawling rose bushes that her late husband Arthur had lovingly planted with his own hands. Patty, completely flustered by the highly unusual request, practically threw the fresh morning bread into the hot oven, filling the entire lower floor of the massive mansion with an incredibly comforting, warm aroma. Lucy quietly and efficiently prepared the outdoor, wrought iron table with a pristine, white tablecloth, freshly squeezed orange juice, and hot coffee, performing her required duties, without offering a single unnecessary comment regarding the surprising change. When Helen finally stepped out into the crisp, leaning heavily on her polished wooden cane, she paused to deeply admire the vibrant, blooming roses, quietly noting aloud that flowers were the only truly honest things left. She softly murmured that unlike complicated people, plants never bothered to fake their actual condition. If they desperately lacked water, they visibly wilted, and if they were well cared for, they unapologetically blossomed for the entire world to see. As Lucy carefully poured the steaming dark coffee into a delicate porcelain cup, Helen suddenly turned her sharp, intelligent eyes upward and calmly asked the young cleaner what her beautiful daughter's given name was. Startled by the completely unexpected personal question, both hands to steady her sudden trembling took a deep breath, and softly replied that her daughter was proudly named Victoria. Later that same chaotic afternoon, Robert finally cornered his remarkably calm mother in the expansive, sunlit living room, desperately demanding a completely honest conversation regarding the devastating secrets silently circulating through their grand home. Which remote mountain town the young cleaner originally came from, expecting the shocking revelation to instantly shatter his mother's perfectly composed, aristocratic exterior. Instead, Helen simply closed the thick novel, resting on her lap, looked at her incredibly wealthy, powerful son, with immense pity, and firmly told him that he urgently needed to stop investigating other people's lives. She pointed her cane toward the large bay window, instructing Robert to look outside, where he watched in total, paralyzed shock as little Victoria, visiting duty to a closed preschool, sat in the garden drawing with his exact, unmistakable childhood posture. Robert's mind, violently, snapped back to a specific, deeply buried, from many years ago, a time when he was desperately attempting to temporarily escape the suffocating, immense pressure of his wealthy family's massive corporate empire. He had aimlessly driven to that incredibly quiet, secluded town in the Berkshire Mountains, fully intending to disappear into total anonymity before eventually accepting his terrifyingly heavy responsibilities as the sole heir to the Blackwood fortune. There, he had met a fiercely intelligent, breathtakingly beautiful nursing student named Lucy, sharing several wonderful, deeply honest months with her, creating a powerful, genuine bond that he had never once replicated in any corporate boardroom. But when his demanding father, Arthur, unexpectedly fell ill and furiously demanded his immediate return to Newport, Robert had packed his expensive bags in the dead of night, cowardly fleeing his true love without leaving a single forwarding address. Now, the following morning, unable to endure the suffocating guilt any longer, Robert woke up incredibly early and purposefully marched down the massive estate kitchens, long before the rest of the wealthy household began stirring. He found Lucy silently restocking her organized cleaning cart near the walk-in pantry. And this time, the cold, calculated distance of a billionaire addressing a humble, hired servant, standing awkwardly, tightly clutched in his shaking hands. He softly admitted that he had spent the entire previous afternoon watching her beautiful daughter playing in the gardens. Her various cleaning supplies turned to face him with absolutely no fear in her striking eyes, and calmly confirmed that Victoria had indeed mentioned a sad man watching her intently from the upper windows. Desperate for absolute clarity, Robert's voice cracked painfully as he humbly asked her, why, out of all the incredibly wealthy estates in the entire coastal region, she had purposefully chosen to seek employment within this specific house. Lucy took a very slow, deep breath, maintaining her flawless, terrifying composure, and explained that one random evening, she firmly clarified that she absolutely did not come to the grand estate seeking revenge, demanding unearned corporate money, or attempting to maliciously destroy his carefully constructed, highly successful public life. She had arrived solely because her precious daughter deserved to know her true biological family, deciding that was entirely incapable of stepping up. She would quietly ensure the elderly grandmother at least knew the child existed. Utterly devastated by the profound, unselfish purity of her noble intentions, Robert felt the heavy around his battered heart completely shatter, asking in a broken whisper, where exactly he currently fit into this incredibly complicated, unfolding narrative. Narratiesiker. Lucy looked at him with an expression entirely devoid of bitter hatred or toxic resentment, offering, instead, a pure, unvarnished honesty that was infinitely more difficult for the powerful businessman to endure. She plainly stated that any future relationship between him and the brilliant little girl was an enormous decision that Victoria alone would have to make when she was completely ready and old enough to fully understand Temple's history. She firmly picked up the handle of her cleaning cart, telling him quietly, but fiercely, was Susansabu's secret son to Vampire King, but fiercely that she was absolutely not there to force a miraculous sudden reconciliation, leaving Robert standing alone in the massive kitchen, with his overwhelming regrets, seeking desperate solace from his chaotic thoughts. Robert wandered out into the sprawling rear gardens, eventually collapsing onto a cold stone bench positioned directly adjacent to his late father's. Impeccably maintained, that little Victoria approached him, carrying her worn sketchbook tucked securely under her small arm, and casually sat down on the exact opposite end of the bench, with the effortless, beautiful innocence unique to children, without any trace of nervous hesitation. The young girl looked directly at the wealthy billionaire and politely asked if he was indeed the incredibly busy son of the nice, sad lady who lived inside the giant house. Startled by her remarkably direct approach, Robert managed a weak, trembling nod, absolutely captivated by the familiar, intense shape of her dark eyes and the incredibly confident, proud angle of her small, fragile chin. Victoria opened her colorful sketchbook, carefully flattening the slightly wrinkled pages, and casually mentioned that her mother often said people who worked far too much usually did so because they were secretly terrified of stopping and facing their true feelings. Hearing his own profound, so accurately and innocently summarized by the brilliant child he had abandoned, Robert completely lost his desperate battle against the massive wave of crushing emotion. For the absolute first time in his entire adult life, the ruthless corporate titan openly wept, covering his face with his large hands as heavy, agonizing sobs violently shook his broad shoulders. Right there in the open garden, Victoria did not panic or run away. Instead, she quietly watched him cry for a long moment, simply stating that her current drawing does not possess a title yet, because the most important pictures require ample time to finish properly. Standing quietly behind the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window of the grand living room, with her hands observed the incredibly clasped over her chest, watching her powerful, emotionally stunted, and crying alongside the beautiful granddaughter she had only just discovered. The elderly matriarch allowed a genuine, profoundly relieved smile to slowly spread across her worn face. The incredibly thick, ever since Arthur's tragic passing, was finally, definitively beginning to aggressively thaw under the warm, undeniable presence of absolute truth. She knew deep in her ancient bones that the difficult, highly emotional journey ahead would be incredibly messy and incredibly painful. But, for the first time in many years, the sprawling mansion, actually felt remarkably full of genuine hope. That evening, long after the heavy sun had completely set beneath the dark ocean horizon, the Blackwood estate grew incredibly quiet, completely devoid of the usual frantic, bustling energy of the large household staff. Helen retreated early to the profound safety of her luxurious master bedroom, slowly walking to the large, antique cedar wardrobe standing silently in the far corner of the dimly lit, expansive room. Reaching deep, pulled out a remarkably plain, worn wooden box that had remained completely hidden and entirely untouched for an incredibly long time. She sat heavily on the edge of her pristine, perfectly made bed, placing the dusty box gently on her lap, handling the old wood as if it contained fragile, incredibly valuable diamonds that might easily shatter into a million pieces. Inside the small box were fading, precious photographs of Robert, eagerly learning to walk, snapshots of him happily helping his proud father plant the very first fragile rose bushes, and a single, wrapped perfectly in expensive soft silk. The thick envelope contained a highly confidential, private letter that her late husband, Arthur, had written during his final, agonizing days, strictly instructing Helen to firmly hold on to it until the exact moment their stubborn son truly needed to hear it. Helen carefully unwrapped the pristine silk with trembling, heavily veined hands, tracing the familiar, elegant handwriting of the only man and she had ever truly loved, with her entire devoted heart, whispering softly into the complete emptiness of the quiet room. She calmly announced to her late husband's finally arrived, and their broken family was finally ready to beautifully heal. Early the following morning, Robert completely stunned his massive corporate empire by aggressively demanding that his highly stressed executive assistant immediately cancel every single high-stakes financial meeting scheduled for the entire week. He completely ignored the frantic, panicked voicemails from his wealthy foreign investors, firmly prioritizing the urgent, desperate reconstruction of his shattered personal life. The endless, exhausting accumulation of more meaningless corporate wealth. Instead of heading to his towering glass office building, he placed a highly confidential phone call to Mr. Thomas, the incredibly loyal, elderly family attorney who had faithfully served out to the Black family for over 40 years. Robert firmly instructed the deeply shocked lawyer to immediately draft the incredibly complex, legally binding documents required for the permanent recognition of paternity, demanding that absolutely no legal loopholes be left open. Mr. Thomas, recovering quickly from his initial profound astonishment, promised to personally deliver the heavily drafted. Hanging up the heavy receiver, Robert sat behind his late father's massive mahogany desk, slowly picking up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen that Arthur had always proudly used to sign important, life-altering family documents. Holding the cold, heavy pen between his shaking fingers, Robert realized with absolute that he was fully preparing to boldly sign the most incredibly important, permanent promise he would ever make in his entire earthly existence. He felt a profound, surging wave wash over him, completely terrified of the massive, looming possibility of brutal rejection, yet feeling absolutely certain was no longer viable. It was shortly after a tense, quiet lunch that Helen formally requested rested Robert's immediate presence in her private, upstairs sitting room. A highly unusual demand that made his pulse race wildly in his chest. Upon heavily entering the deeply personal space, he found his calm mother sitting gracefully near the large window, directly holding the old, silk-wrapped letter out toward him with a remarkably steady, deeply encouraging hand. She softly explained that his late father had written the profound letter specifically for him, predicting with incredible, eerie accuracy that Robert would eventually lose his way in the cold, unforgiving pursuit of massive, isolating wealth. With visibly trembling hands, Robert took the old, fragile paper, reading his beloved father's urgent, posthumous plea to completely abandon the easy, cowardly path and courageously choose the difficult, incredibly rewarding journey of genuine love. Finished reading the devastating, beautiful letter, tears streaming freely down his tired face. The exact words Lucy had whispered to her on that very first rainy night. The Beardy King. Lucy had gently told the weeping widow that she was absolutely not alone, promising that Arthur's loving spirit continued to boldly survive. In a beautiful, brilliant granddaughter, his intense eyes and strong hands. Hearing this profound, ultimate confirmation of Lucy's incredible selfless grace, Robert felt the final, remaining pieces of his massive, arrogant ego completely dissolve into absolute nothingness, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of his massive failures. He finally, but rather to miraculously save his grieving family from completely drowning in their own suffocating, endless ocean of silent sorrow. Armed with his late father's powerful, loving blessing, and his strong mother's completely unwavering, fierce support, Robert slowly stood up from the comfortable chair, wiping the wet tears from his exhausted, red eyes. He realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that he now desperately needed to bravely face the absolute hardest, most intimidating task of his entire, highly successful life, asking for profound forgiveness without holding a tension of actually receiving it. He possessed absolutely no legal right or moral standing to suddenly barge into their quiet lives, demanding instant, unearned affection from a brilliant child he had knowingly abandoned for so many years. Yet as he firmly walked out of the sprawling, historic estate and headed directly toward his sleek car, he swore to the universe that he would spend the rest of his remaining days tirelessly proving he was finally worthy. Imenadicit. Robert left behind his wealth and pride to visit Lucy and little Victoria in their modest apartment, hoping to make amends. Kneeling before the child, he confessed his true identity and apologized for taking so long to find her. After quietly reflecting, Victoria drawing titled First Meeting and said she was willing to give him a chance because his sincere tears convinced her he was capable of genuine love. 2 weeks later, the family gathered for a hopeful dinner at the Blackwood estate, where Victoria's new chair symbolized her place in their lives. The following day, Helen, Robert, Lucy, and Victoria planted a rose bush beside Arthur's roses and named it New Beginnings, marking the start of their shared future. Months later, as the rosebush bloomed, Victoria completed her drawing, now showing 4 smiling family members together under the title, The Family We Choose to Plant. Like the growing garden, their once broken relationships took root through honesty, forgiveness, and daily commitment. Ode. Their journey showed that true family is built blood, but by the courage to face the past, nurture trust, and remain present through hardship. In the end, love, patience, and reconciliation proved that even the deepest regrets can blossom to securing legacy, hope, and enduring connection.